Hi, I'm Michael Frye, and welcome to the first segment in my two videos about Lightroom 4. Thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate your taking the time to tune in. Now, Lightroom 4 represents a big change. I think it's the biggest change to Adobe's RAW processing engine since they came out with Adobe Camera Raw back in 2003. And because it's such a big change, there's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to divide this video into two parts. In this first part, I'm going to talk about the differences, what's different between Lightroom 3 and Lightroom 4 and how the new tools work. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about how to use those new tools, how I'm using them and some suggestions for how you can get the most out of the new process. So in this first segment, we're going to start with one of the changes, the automatic highlight recovery and black point setting in the new process. And I'll talk about why you might not want to update older images to the new process. The new tone controls have some new names and some old names, but the behavior for all these tools has changed, so we'll look at that. We'll also look at the default settings, which really are the same as the old ones, just the numbers have changed. And we'll take an in-depth look at each of the new basic tone controls and how they really work. This first segment is about 25 minutes long, so grab a cup of coffee, sit back, relax. I think you'll learn some things about how the new process works and how to use the new tools to get the most out of your images. Now let's start by taking a rather high contrast image here, and I've got it in the old process, the 2010 process, at the Adobe defaults, 5 blacks plus 50 brightness plus 25 contrast and the medium contrast point curve. If we go down to the bottom of the right hand panel in the develop module here in Lightroom to camera calibration, you can see I've got it in process 2010. That's the Lightroom 3 process, and I'm going to update it to the 2012 process. That's the current one for Lightroom 4, or I can click on this little exclamation point here. Let's update it to the new process, and when I did that, you could see kind of a subtle change. I'll do this again. So old process there and new process there. It looks a little flatter, less contrasty. Let's go back to the old one, and I'm going to hit the J key to turn on the clipping alerts. Shows highlight clipping in red and shadow clipping in blue. And we update to the new process. What happens? Well, the highlight clipping has disappeared and the shadow clipping is much less. We see just a little bit down here. So that's one of the first differences between the 2010 process and the new 2012 process. Automatic highlight recovery and automatic black point setting. So if there are overexposed highlights in a photograph, when you update it to the new process or you import it into Lightroom 4 in the new process, it will automatically recover overexposed highlights if it can, if there's detail there to be recovered. And it will also automatically change the black point if there are large areas of pure black, of clipped black shadows. It'll lessen those by changing the black point, and that gives you more shadow detail. So we'll look at this again without the clipping triangles here, and you can see that it's both lightening the shadows. This is the old process, and in the new process it's lightening the shadows and bringing down the highlights a little bit. We'll zoom in to El Cap here and go to the old process. You can see that the highlights here look a little washed out, and in the new process that highlight detail has been recovered automatically. And I think those are both good. I'd rather not have washed out highlights in most photographs, and I'd rather not have a lot of black. I'd like to have a little more shadow detail. And doing that automatically is just fine, and you can always override that by using the white slider to set a white point, or the black slider to set a black point, or by setting a white point or black point with the point curve. Now, this was an image at the Adobe defaults. Let's look at another photograph that I processed in Lightroom 3, and you can see that I made a really sharp sort of lightning S-curve and changed the white point and black point a little bit, used a little bit of recovery and fill light, and I did a lot of dodging and burning here as well. I'm going to click on this triangle and update to the current process, again the new process, and this time I think you'll see a bigger change. Okay, there, it took a minute, but I'll do that again, just so you can see. Okay, here was the old process and here's the new process. So at the default settings, the changes are pretty minor when you update, but if you've processed a photograph in Lightroom 3 and you update to the new process, you're likely to see some significant differences. And it doesn't matter whether you made those changes with curves or you use the basic sliders or whatever. In fact, you might even see bigger changes if you use the basic sliders. The new process is so different from the old process that it's really just hard to map the tones from one to the other. And so the moral of this story is, if you processed an image in Lightroom 3 and you're happy with the way it looks, there's no reason to update to the new process. It's just fine to keep it in that old process. You'll have to look at this little exclamation point in the develop module, but otherwise it's no big deal. And updating to the new process, things might look so different that you're just going to make a lot of work for yourself to change it and sort of fix it and get it back to where it was. In fact, the new process is so different that when I do update an image that I've previously processed in Lightroom 3, I figure that I'm just going to have to start over. I'm just going to have to reset everything to the defaults and start from scratch. Also, you're going to see the most benefit to updating the process with high contrast images. You're probably not going to see much benefit with lower contrast images. Okay, let's look at another photograph and a rather low contrast image with the this is in the old process and at Adobe's default settings. I'm going to update to the new process and really can't tell the difference, right? It looks pretty much the same. That's because there's no clipped highlights or shadows, so it's not recovering highlights or altering the black point automatically, and so it looks pretty much the same at the default settings. Now you might also notice some other changes here, right? So we'll do that again. We'll go back to the old process. We had exposure, recovery, fill light, blacks, brightness, and contrast. Okay, those are the tone controls in the basic panel. And in the new process, things are a little bit different. We have exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So some of the names are the same, exposure, contrast, and blacks. Some are different, like these three. Even in the ones where the names are the same, the behavior of these tools has changed. So it's really quite a different beast in Lightroom 4. You'll also notice that the numbers have changed, right? So again, back in the old process, we had these default settings and this medium contrast point curve. We go to the new process and everything is zeroed and the curve is straight, linear. Now, does that mean that Adobe finally came to its senses and took out the boost in midtones that the brightness default used to give and the boost in contrast from the contrast slider and that medium contrast tone curve? No. The defaults are really just the same. In fact, they're exactly the same. Just the numbers have changed. So that plus 50 brightness doesn't exist anymore, but that's incorporated. That sort of boost in midtones is incorporated into the 0 default setting in the exposure slider. And 0 contrast is equivalent to plus 25 before. And 0 blacks is equivalent to the 5 in blacks before. And there really is not a true linear point curve anymore. that medium contrast curve that we see here, with let me try that again, with a little bit of an S curve and kind of a dip in the shadows, is the baseline starting point, what's called linear in the new process. Now, I'm not thrilled about losing a true linear point curve here, but I can live with it, and I think the improvements in Lightroom 4 are worth the trade-off there. And as far as the other settings go, I can always override those if I want to start at a different place. The equivalent of the 0 brightness in Lightroom 4 is setting the exposure to -1. The equivalent to having contrast at 0 in the old process is setting contrast down to -33. And the equivalent of having blacks at 0 in the old process is putting blacks at +25 in the new process. And the equivalent of a true linear curve in the new process is this weird reverse S with a whole bunch of points, a very impractical starting point. But as I say, I don't think that's that big a deal. And I'll talk more about that, about default settings and what's a good starting point in the second segment. All right, we'll go back to Adobe's default settings here for Lightroom 4. There we go. Another thing that you'll notice is that all of these sliders go two ways. Before, some of them, like say recovery, started at 0 and you'd push it to the right to add recovery, to add highlight recovery. Now all of the sliders, if you move them to the left, it darkens, and you move it to the right, it lightens. That's pretty obvious with exposure, but highlights now, if you want to darken highlights, you move it to the left. Here, sorry, let me set that back to the Adobe defaults there. So you move highlights to the left, you darken highlights, you move them to the right, you lighten highlights. And same thing with whites. If you want to darken the lightest pixels in the image, you slide this to the left, and if you want to lighten the whites, set a white point, you move it to the right. So left darkens and right lightens in all the sliders in Lightroom 4. Alright, let's take a look at these individual controls. Now, exposure has the same name as one of the tools in the old process, but its behavior has changed significantly. In Lightroom 3, if you pushed exposure to the right, and I'll turn on the clipping warnings again. If you pushed exposure to the right, you could set a white point, right? You could clip white, so we can see some clipping starting to happen here. And I didn't make a very big move here, 0.7. With Lightroom 4, if I push that exposure slider to the right, it takes a big move to get some clipping. Look at that. See how bright the image is. It's completely washed out. And the number is plus 0.275. So in Lightroom 4, the exposure slider is not designed for doing white point clipping, for setting a white point. It's really much more like the brightness slider in the old process, where it's essentially just moving the midpoint in the image up or down, brightening or darkening the midtones without changing the ends, without changing the black point or the white point. And it's kind of like, if you're familiar with curves, it's kind of like taking a point in the middle of the curve and moving it up and to the left to boost the midtones, or down and to the right to darken those midtones. In the new process, you use the white slider to set a white point, or of course you can do it with the point curve. Now the contrast slider is pretty similar to the old contrast slider. Right? You push it to the right, that increases contrast, and push it to the left, that decreases contrast. And what it's essentially doing is making an S-curve or a reverse S-curve. Right? So if you make an S-curve like this, that's equivalent to pushing the contrast slider to the right. If you push the contrast slider to the left, it's equivalent to making sort of a reverse S like this, and reducing mid-tone contrast. Alright, now to understand the next tools, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. We actually have to kind of talk about these together, I think. I'm going to go back to that first image that we looked at, and I think this will demonstrate the highlights and shadows tools a little bit better. I'm going to go back to the old process here for a second, and we'll take off the clipping triangles, and I'll push the recovery slider to the right all the way up to 100. You can see that that darkened the brightest areas of the image, the highlights. Okay, it did recover the washed out highlights. Kind of flattens the lighter areas a bit, right? It darkens them, but they look kind of dull and flat. Let's go to the new process here, okay? And the equivalent of that, the closest equivalent to that, is actually pushing the white slider to the left. That sort of darkens the brightest areas of the image and does also flatten them a bit. There's a little bit more contrast and detail than when you use the recovery slider in the old process, but not much. The highlights slider, on the other hand, affects more than just the brightest tones, right? You can see as I push this to the left that it's getting down into the midtones more. You can see that both in the image itself and in the histogram. If you look at the histogram move here, you can see it's moving all the way down to about here. What's great about this tool is that even though it's darkening the lighter tones in the image, it's doing it in a way that still keeps local contrast. There's lots of contrast and snap. It's not flat like using the recovery slider in the old process. Now the shadows tool is roughly equivalent to the fill light slider in the old process. So again, fill light, we push that to the right in the old process and it lightens shadows. If we go too far, it looks really flat and washed out. A moderate move might be okay and it doesn't look too bad. Let's update to the new process here and we'll try pushing that shadow slider to the right. Remember, going to the right lightens. And we can't go as far. So Adobe is almost acting as image guardian here, preventing you from doing ugly things to the photograph. But a modest move, again, brings out some nice shadow detail and does it in a very natural looking way while still keeping, again, lots of snap and sort of local contrast in the image. So, starting with this rather high contrast photograph here, again, I'll go back to the default settings here. I can make a move with the highlight slider to bring down the highlights, and then we'll bring out a little bit more shadow detail. And wow, just those two simple little moves have made this image look a lot better. Oh, and before we move on to the whites and blacks sliders here, setting white points and black points, there's one more thing I want to talk about in terms of highlight recovery in Lightroom 4. So this is an image that I posted on my blog recently, and kind of the finished version that I finished in Lightroom 4. I'm going to take it back to the old process with the default settings that I use in the old process, everything at 0 and the point curve linear. And I mean, it looks pretty bad. Especially the highlights here, just completely washed out, no detail. If we zoom in there, you can see that indeed it's quite washed out and not much detail here. If I push the recovery slider to the right, I can bring back detail in most of that area, not in this little spot here. But the places where I did recover detail don't look very good. They look kind of splotchy. Areas are sort of grayed out. Basically, it just doesn't work as you might hope it would. So I'm going to set that back to the default and update to the current process, and wow, big improvement. So again, that's that automatic highlight recovery kicking in. And not only did it automatically recover highlight detail, but what it did recover looks much better. Smoother, none of that blotchiness. It has the colors that you would expect. If we bring down the highlights and and the whites, either one, there's highlights. You can see that there's really still no detail in this spot. And same thing here, right? So no detail in this spot either. So I don't think that Lightroom 4, the new process, really is better at recovering more overexposed highlights. In other words, if it can't recover the highlight detail in Lightroom 3, it's probably not going to be able to do it in Lightroom 4 either. But what it can recover looks much better, and it does so automatically, right? So in fact, moving the highlights or white slider to the left to sort of bring down those upper tones can make an area that's overexposed actually stand out more. So if in the new process Lightroom can recover highlight detail, it's going to do so automatically, and there's sometimes not much benefit to to moving these to the left, the highlights or white sliders to the left, in terms of just actually recovering highlight detail. As we saw in that previous image, there can be a great benefit to moving that highlight slider to the left, just to just to bring down the highlights and balance the image and bring out nice texture and contrast there. But you may not be able to actually recover more highlight detail with the highlights or white sliders than the process can do automatically. Okay, let's look at how to set white point and black point in the new process. Now in the old process, there were two ways of setting a white point. One of those was with the exposure slider, and the other was by moving the upper end of the point curve. And you can still do that, of course, in the new process. But I never liked using the exposure slider to set a white point in the old process, and I'll show you why. I've gone back here to the 2010 process. Everything is at the Adobe defaults, except I've moved the exposure slider up to where we can just see a little bit of clipping right there. And then I've done the same thing. I've set essentially the same white point in the new process. Okay, everything else is at the defaults, but I've moved the white slider up to we just get a little bit of clipping right there, and you can see that there's a lot better contrast in the image. Okay, so here's Lightroom 3 setting that white point with the exposure slider. It also boosts the midtones, and the whole image looks kind of washed out. And in the new process, we can set a white point without boosting those midtones, and so we retain good detail in the highlights. And I think that's a big improvement. It's great to have a way of setting a white point without boosting the midtones and washing out highlights in the process, especially for people who don't want to use the point curve. Now, moving the black slider to the left is also a good way of setting a black point. Neither of these, though, is quite the same as setting a black or white point with the point curve. I mean, they're both good, but they're just different. So when you set a white point with a point curve, you're creating kind of a straight line where when you move this white point, you're moving the midtones about half as much and the black point not at all. Same thing if you move the black point again, you're moving the midtones about half as much. When you move the black point or the black slider in Lightroom 4 to the left, it's kind of like doing this. It's almost like anchoring the highlights and then just moving the black point and the shadows and maybe a little bit of a move like that. If you move the white point, or excuse me, the white slider to the right, you're almost like anchoring the shadow tones and moving the white point over, and again maybe a little bit of a move like that. So not quite the same, but either way, whether you're moving the black and white points with the whites or black sliders or with the point curve, you're keeping good contrast and separation in the tones throughout the image. Now the behavior of the curve hasn't changed, right? So if you're familiar with using the point curve, Although the baseline has changed, you can still use it essentially the same way, and that goes for the parametric curve as well. One other small change is the clarity slider, where it's really kind of on steroids now. If you push it really far, it makes the image look quite crunchy. And so I find that I'm using about half the amount of clarity that I used to. So that's a look at some of the changes in the new process with Lightroom 4. In the next segment, we'll talk about how to use these new tools. And until then, thanks for watching.